Hello and welcome to the webinar. We are excited to have you here as part of the PathLock Innovation Series. My name is Stephanie Anderson. I'm the Global Webinar Manager here at PathLock. Our session right now is with Protiviti. It's titled Defining, Identifying, and Managing System Changes in Oracle Cloud. Garrett Burnell, Director at Protiviti, and Ryan Briscoe, Senior Manager at Protiviti, are our presenters today, and they'll introduce themselves in just a moment.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Appreciate it. Little introduction here. My name is Garrett Burnell with Protiviti. I'm a director. I've been working with Protiviti for about 17 years. I am specifically in our Oracle practice, and what that means for me is I help organizations as they're moving to Oracle technologies. Lately, the last few years, has been a tremendous shift going cloud. So I find myself many times governing large-scale transformations, helping with application security, design, and configuration, architecting and leading testing activities, and lots of other large activities that take place in an implementation. Ryan?
Sure. Appreciate the time today. I'm Ryan Briscoe. I'm a senior manager at Protiviti out of our Atlanta office. I've been with the firm going on 7.5 years. Echo Garrett in the same practice within our Oracle Security and Controls specific business unit workstream. Most projects I work in the space between EBS and cloud as transformations are ongoing, making sure that we understand the differences between the control environments, between on-premise and cloud applications, and making sure we understand and have a clear framework and design for what that looks like going forward in the cloud environment. So look forward to talking with you today. Back to you, Garrett.
Awesome, fantastic. So again, I think Stephanie framed this up very well. We're here to talk about change, specifically in Oracle Cloud, and a real kind of overview of the different areas we'll talk about. We feel like this is a common challenge that many organizations face. It's unfortunately one that they're facing when it's too late to do anything about. So really a lot of our perspective we'll talk about today is how do I get ahead of this situation? Just to frame up why we should even care. The risk of not having a good grasp or command of changes in your Oracle Cloud environment. You could have a platform that's unstable or unreliable from both the business and the IT perspective. But also, if you look at the regulatory or the audit element, at some point you might have some audits or reviews performed. And if you can't demonstrate really good discipline, it could yield or produce outcomes such as observations, significant deficiencies, etc. So really, this is a situation you want to be ahead of. But today we'll talk about how do I even define change? What does that mean? So the word change could mean different things to different people. And we're going to say, how is a change different than just toggling or modifying a setting? Because cloud lets me do that. How are these even happening? What lets somebody, an end user, make changes? And who would even be interested in a change? Which parties care and how much do they care? And then after we agree on what the scope is of changes, we'll say, well, how do I even get my arms around it? How do I identify changes? We'll talk about a few different methods. There's manual, where I can go navigate. I can probably take screenshots and say, I know the setting as of today at this moment. And there's also systematic options to say, I would like to be made aware if there's ever a change and to capture both the prior setting and the current setting. We'll talk about some native capabilities that Oracle Cloud offers you, really hitting on the audit policy feature. And we'll talk about some third-party tools as well. And after we've defined what change is and then how you can identify it, we'll talk about, well, how do I manage it and how do I get proactive and stay ahead of this? So we'll discuss that conversation you should be having and leading with any other parties or stakeholders, including your audit functions. Agree what change is. Don't leave it as an open-ended statement. Really drive this drive and find agreement for what change is. We'll really focus on who should even be making changes in your world. It's not just an IT activity. Business does have some very specific use cases where they should be the ones making certain changes. And then also, what processes can you wrap around this to really govern and make sure that only changes you want and that are approved are making their way into your system. First, we'll kind of look at a scenario. I think this is all too common for certain organizations. We've maybe experienced this ourselves. But if you say, well, here's a little interaction. You've got an annual change request, and the far left portion is someone saying, hi, I'm here for SOX control testing. I need to see all your changes that ever happened in the last year. It's a very broad, wide open statement. And very typically we see a reaction as something to the extent of, Do you mean workflow changes? Do you mean changes to reports, configuration or setting modifications? Like what changes do you mean? And the response is yes. I need all of those. I need all of them yesterday. I need to know what they were, what they are today. Show me the approvals you had to make sure those were okay. And if you're going to do screenshots, please get the date and the timestamp so that I know it's for this audit cycle. So it's a fun dance, but I think the result that we too often see is that it is a scramble, and you do have organizations say, I was not ready for this request for whatever reason, and now I'm finding myself backing into finding evidence that I can say, look, our changes were intentional and correct. And that kind of maneuvering, it does not always show well. And we see that it's a lot of time spent doing that. You're asking IT to help you identify things and evidence. So it's more time in addition to their day jobs. But ultimately, what you could have as a result, you could have significant deficiencies or material weaknesses. And those are very publicly facing. We all know those can hit our financial reports, and those have a lot of implications to our organization. But again, this is too many times this is the conversation we see take place. And before we kind of start talking about what changes are, I do want to share you're not alone if you have some of these perspectives. These are not unique across an industry or an organization, but I do want to point out that they're not correct. So if you're hearing things like this within your organization, you're well within your rights to ask questions and kind of strive to understand and ensure that we all know and mean the same thing. I'll pick a few of these and just kind of walk through some of my favorites. The very first one is you can't track changes. Auditing will bog down the system. And I think that was used in the on-premise world. Quite often in the EBS space, we would hear that absolutely don't turn it on, we can't run our business. It's just not the case anymore with cloud. Oracle is an absolute fantastic system. It's got to have an easy way to export all changes. It's Oracle. And unfortunately, that's not true either. There's not a master report that gives you everything you need if this request comes across your desk. Quarterly updates, they don't impact my configurations at all because I can always kick the can down the road and do it later. Some of those are optional. Some of those you can defer, but some of those are not optional, and you will take those. So you need to appreciate what those changes are. And then also, people can only make necessary changes. We'd know something if it went wrong. We wouldn't be able to run our business. We'd have issues, etc. And again, that's not always the case. There can be changes that are made that are not super evident, but they would pop up on an audit. So good list of things that you might hear from some of your colleagues. It's an indication that maybe we're not aligned. So as we move into what are changes, what we've got here is a little cheat sheet. We've got some examples or different ways in which a change can be introduced to your environment. So again, you might say, my understanding was that Oracle Cloud is a SaaS or a cloud-based application. Therefore, the vendor, Oracle, they own all the changes to the source code, and that's not wrong. They own the source code and the foundational code and protecting it to make sure it's not moving all over the place. But they do allow you as an end user to interact and modify settings and configuration. So ones we see quite often, master data. I don't think there's a business out there that doesn't change data regularly. And really the ones we hear and see quite a bit, you're constantly doing business with other folks, suppliers. You're hopefully gathering and identifying new customers. As your organization grows, your chart of accounts might need to expand to accommodate that. So those are pretty common master data updates. Key configuration changes. These are configurations in your system that help drive your business processes behavior, and they're very important to you because they've achieved the key designation, which that means you've categorized them to be very important. So things like the payment terms or your approval limits, these are ways that really help influence the way your business operates. And if they change, you would want to know about it, and it would probably alter your day-to-day. Approval workflows, these are talking about the guardrails. These are the maneuvering activities that can help facilitate participation in a process, review, and approval. These are fantastic. We think these are great guardrails. You'll see them around journal approvals, invoice approvals, and there's quite a few others. But what you wouldn't want to happen is you wouldn't want to have those changed without a lot of scrutiny and thought put behind it, because you would want to make sure only certain parties are participating, that they're participating when they should in a certain area or space. So again, those are important, and you don't want those to be changed without thought. Application security, this is At the end of the day, this is how people can do their jobs in the system. And so a role being empowered with more privilege or capability, that would be an expansion of a role. And that would absolutely be a change that would be something you'd care about and your auditors would care about. Quarterly updates, again, this is probably the more unique situation when you're talking about cloud or SaaS versus the old EBS days. This is the continued advancement of the platform and the product that we all like and that we're all using to run our business. But the fact is, you do need to accept and take on these new features and capabilities at some point. Again, you can defer some for a certain duration, but at some point you are likely going to be on a common platform similar to other users of the product. Reports, there's a lot of ability to modify reports, whether they're static reports that are not OTBI, they're more custom BP reports. But what if someone wanted to add an extra column to an OTBI report? What if they just intended to give more information in that report? Technically, that's a change, and it could influence the legitimacy of the content. And then integrations, we all know that the ERP is the hub, the platform, but there's a lot of information flowing to and from it. So what if those inbound and outbound integrations, what if they were changed? It would likely influence the information you're giving or receiving. So again, this is just a cheat sheet. It's not the universe, but it does represent very common changes that we see. The question we commonly get is, then why are these even happening? How is this taking place? I feel like I'm getting come at from different angles. And really, a lot of this comes down to the number one reason, the primary reason, your security architecture is allowing this to happen. It's not right or wrong. It's just that's the enabling factor. So at the end of the day, we all log into the system and we can all do things. An old term I like is, security is who can do what on which data. So who is the user, can do what is the actual functional capabilities on which data is clearly the data. So if you're seeing changes that are happening in your environment and you were not expecting it, it's either a role that somebody was given that has too much capability. You might need to have those conversations of, well, do I need to give them a different role? Did they get the wrong one? Or should I even entertain maybe custom security because that seeded security, maybe it gave too much access and I'm not comfortable with folks having that change capability. So again, security, it's the enabling factor that's letting changes happen. And it's almost a balancing act. It's where we see a lot of fine tuning can take place to really tighten down and make sure not too many changes are taking place. And here we'll talk a little bit about who cares. A lot of different parties we've mentioned here already, but why do they care? How do they care? It's different. So I put myself in the shoes of the business, and I'll kind of go vertical by vertical here. The business, they often are the changer. They are the person that says, hey, at the end of the day, I'm running the business, I'm executing processes, I'm needing a system that works for me, that's reliable, so that I can absolutely service my customers and engage with partners, et cetera. So they say, I need to be able to move at the speed of business, which means we're going to have a very dynamic environment. We're changing as we grow. And I need to be able to tweak the system to adjust with our growth. So you'll see down there, it says this may include events such as, I've got new customers, I want to add them there and I want to represent them appropriately. Or I've got personnel within my organization that have grown and now they need to move around in the organization. They participate in a different way. And then also maybe there's business settings like a threshold. I want to specify who needs to look at an invoice if it's of a certain size, or a payment going out the door and has to have extra layers of scrutiny. So the business really is effectively, they can be the one changing and introducing quite a bit of change. If you're IT, you would say, well, actually, I kind of straddle both, and maybe I'm a hybrid. I'm responsible for making sure the platform works for the business, but I can be the source of change as well as a fixer. So in order for me to help make sure the business has the tools they need, I'm going to triage items. I'm going to look at a ticket they've raised. I'm going to try to understand why something's not working the way it should be. And the solution, the resolution might be, I need to incorporate more changes. I need to adjust things. So they obviously need to listen to what's happening. But again, they're just another avenue or another party that can introduce change. And if you go to the very far right, you'll see that there's a different party here. This is the one that I think, unfortunately, too commonly catches a bad rap, but they play a very important role. So audit, whether that's internal or external, you'll see that they say, I'm here helping you. I put my name on the dotted line. I'm vouching for your financials. So play a really important part here. And it's critical for me to be able to say, I know that your system is churning out and showing accurate and complete information. So in order for me to do that and to provide you with assurance, I need to know that the changes that took place in your environment, they were intended, and that the right folks looked at them and approved them. I'm going to make sure that those changes were put through testing, that they were validating, that they were working the way they should have, and they were producing the right results. But again, these are the three parties that in some shape or form, they care differently. What I think is really important is to make sure they're on the same page and that we all agree what change is, and that we're all working towards the same goal. Too often we do see a different level of interpretation, and then you've got that mad scramble we talked about earlier. We're going to switch a little bit here, and I'll pass it over to Ryan.
Awesome. Thanks, Garrett. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how we can identify those changes that Garrett was alluding to. And first and foremost, before I go into the different tools that you have at your disposal to do so, just wanted to reinforce the point that once you and your stakeholders have come to an agreement on what those key changes to master data, key configurations, and those key transactions are, it's important to use the full suite of preventative controls you have at your disposal within Oracle to make sure that you're limiting that manual effort required by the business and audit to go back and evidence that. So when I say that, I'm speaking more to your approval workflows, like Garrett alluded to. The ability to have additional approval limits, the addition of configurable controls that allow you to do matching, et cetera, between invoices, purchase orders, payments, et cetera. Those preventative controls, if you have comfort around those, limit the need to go back and either monitor or evidence a lot of these in a reactive manner afterwards. Once you've aligned on what those key transactions are, key master data elements are, and the other key configurations that you need to monitor outside of those buckets, and also the configurable controls and those key configurations that control those preventative controls are that you would need to monitor ongoing to make sure that those processes don't change. You do have additional tools at your disposal that you can use to do so. Several are within Oracle as well natively. The first we want to talk about specifically is Oracle's audit policies. So like Garrett alluded to, the days are gone of old where you don't have the ability to enable audit policies without the fear of significantly impacting performance. I know in EBS world, back in the day, audit policy word just tended to be something that everyone had a look at disdain on their face when that was brought up in stakeholder meetings, trying to figure out how are we going to monitor things ongoing, given it sits on the database. Given this, we live in now a SaaS cloud environment where that is no longer a concern. You have innate functionality within Oracle ERP, HCM, the Cloud Suite to enable specific audit policies to monitor business objects, other configurations such as access or changes to access, changes to key metadata, also changes to key configurations around integrations, et cetera, and also around reporting. So with that said, a lot of customers aren't aware of that up front, and we like to make sure that people are fully aware that that is innate functionality that you can enable out of the box, and it's free, which is the nice thing. We'll, in the next slide, which don't go to yet, Garrett, but we'll look at the specifics around what some of those key elements are that you can configure and what the reporting capabilities are out of that, but I just wanted to call that out up front. With that said, granted, it is nice that we live in a world now where you can use that functionality without impacting performance. You still don't want to create a lot of noise in your environment just by going in and turning everything on. So we'd like to come to customers with what we would consider a best practice set of policies that you would turn on just to monitor those truly key transactions, key elements of master data, and those nuanced transactions that fall outside of those preventative controls that you have, hopefully capturing that level of comfort up front. That way you're not just, for example, capturing a bunch of highly voluminous transactions such as regular journal entries or invoices. But with that said, once you've defined that audit policy framework, there still are going to be some nuanced edge cases where you'd ideally like to have some additional logic or some additional reporting available to look at those edge cases where you don't have the monitoring capability via an audit policy. I don't have it listed here, but something we would suggest around that. There are some third-party tools that have logic-based transaction and configuration monitoring available. And also within Oracle, you can define OTBI reports and business intelligence reports that look at those key edge cases just so that you can then hone in on what auditors are truly going to care about after you've given them the more expansive audit policy logging that you've defined via the audit policy functionality. And so an example of that, sticking with the GL example, would be, what about manual journal entries that may have gotten around an approval? Those are edge cases where, you know, auditors are still going to care about that, but they're not highly voluminous. In that case, you could either have logic-based third-party tools looking at that, like Pathlock and others that look at, is the same user creating that subledger journal entry? Did it go for approval? If it didn't, did that user push it through? If not, did that go through an approval where they somehow push it through with their own approval, et cetera? And those would be things that you could provide via that, or an OTBI report with similar logic built into it. So switching gears a little bit, switching over to the right, you see Pathlock's name there. I just spoke to a little bit of Pathlock's functionality. There are third-party tools that do basically everything I said via audit policy. And I forgot to mention too, when I say logging, I mean capturing before and after values, you know, the date as to when a configuration or master data element transaction happened or was changed, et cetera. All those things are captured in audit policies, but they are also captured in third-party tools like Pathlock, in addition to other fields that may not be available via native audit policy. And they also provide, you know, more intuitive reporting with less manual effort on the setup side of things when you have to go in and configure your audit policies to provide similar logging, and provide that additional layer of logic in some of those edge cases where you truly need to hone in on those nuances in the transactions and changes that you can't via the native Oracle functionality. So that's another tool that you have at your disposal, or tools like that. And then just wanted to speak a little bit to the third bucket there you see around configuration export tools. So that's more so aligning with the quarterly patch update testing process that you would typically have to go through when you adopt those patches. And like Garrett said, you know, a lot of that has changed via old world and new world when you have to opt into a patch or opt into a release, as we call it nowadays. You know, you're going to get some stuff pushed down without the ability to opt out of it, and some of it you are going to opt into. And either way, from an audit perspective, an auditor is going to want to see that you tested that upfront in a lower environment, and make sure that you clearly document what you are and aren't opting into, what is inherently going to be pushed down, and making sure all of that is working correctly and documented. And then you're also going to need the ability to show that, okay, well, now that I know that, I can show that from a third-party perspective, that is the way I said we defined it in that environment, and make sure that it gets configured in your production environment or migrated to your production environment in the same way. That can be a very onerous ask of business, audit, or whoever is responsible for going in and doing that level of investigation and documentation. And there are third-party tools that do allow you to look at this from the outside in and say, okay, now that I know I've tested this, this tool can go in and show me all the current state configurations as they sit today in the lower environment. And then also bump that up as you migrate into your production environment to make sure everything is then configured and documented in the same way in your production environment. I say that with the lens of just going through it from a testing during the release process perspective, but you can also use similar tools as part of your routine configuration reviews if you do that as part of an audit function quarterly, biannually, et cetera. So those are just a couple of tools that you have at your disposal, or tools like these, and we just wanted to call those out specifically. Now we can move on to the next slide, Garrett, and I'll talk to a little more detail around audit policies. Perfect. So like I mentioned, audit policies are an out-of-the-box feature within ERP and HCM that a lot of customers aren't aware that you can just go in and turn on for free. With that said, there are several different buckets of functionality that you can audit via audit policies, and you see those listed on the right. That's actually a snippet from the screen where you enable the audit policies to be tracked. There are specific roles and two specific permissions or privileges in Oracle speak that you have to enable for a user to get to this page and then be able to view reports and manipulate these policies. I don't have the technical name of those listed here, but we have some additional material I can share that can point you at how to do that. But once you do that, you can get here and you can enable the audit logging for each of these buckets. The first bucket, where you see Oracle Fusion applications, that allows you to configure audit logging for over 100 plus business objects. That's down at the actual business object and its child objects. And you can define what attributes and what fields you want to monitor on those objects. So again, speaking back to the prior slide a little bit, once you define what those key configurations are, those key edge case transactions or the key master data transactions that you need to track, you can go in there and then just identify the specific fields. You want to track the before and after values, who did the change, who created the event and when it happened, et cetera, and that all is stored in audit reporting from there forward. The other 5 buckets here, they don't allow that level of granularity, at least from a configuration perspective. When I say configuration, configuration of what you're planning to track, not what the configuration is you're tracking. But you still can select high, medium, and low values of what level of detail you would like to evaluate at a high level to track for all of these buckets. Those buckets are pages and business objects, Oracle Enterprise Scheduling Services, Oracle Metadata, Oracle Platform Security Services, and the Oracle SOA Suite. I won't speak to all of those, but I will speak to 3 of them, or two additional ones in specific, that kind of align with some of the key points Garrett pointed out that you would need to track as part of your ongoing monitoring. The second of which, in addition to the Fusion Applications piece, is Platform Security Services. So you see that in the second bullet on the left there. That allows you to track before and after changes to user security from a role assignment perspective, and also changes to roles themselves if you select the appropriate high, medium, or low setting for that. So that gives you the comfort around application security as to who is changing what and who is getting what access if that's needed as a look back. The third bullet there is around Oracle SOA Suite. So that's alluding to more of your approval workflow perspective. I know I mentioned if you're using those preventative controls effectively up front, a lot of times we can eliminate a lot of this manual look back when we know transactions and processes are flowing with the appropriate level of comfort and approval and control. To do that, we need to make sure that the workflows and those controls are not being modified on the fly by the inappropriate folks. And if so, we can document who and what it was and tie that to a change ticket. This setting here, if you enable it at the right high, medium, and low setting, will allow you to do that, and it will track who made changes to key approval workflows, again, before and after values, what they are, et cetera, and that can be your look back comfort there. That's a high level of just the audit policy configuration and kind of how that works. I will say one additional point here, just to make sure that when you're trying to rely on this, you don't shoot yourselves in the foot, so to speak. When you do assign the access to be able to come in and configure these for audit reporting and monitoring, a lot of times if you aren't careful and don't clearly define roles that limit the access to the appropriate folks to do that, you'll end up giving that access as part of a more expansive seated role to either IT or some of the more setup related business users that may not even be aware they have access to it. The problem with that is if those folks are involved with any of the other control processes, for example, if they're involved in approving journal entries, or if they're involved with being an owner of doing key configuration changes outside of audit policy realms, then if an auditor comes in and pulls a security access report, they're going to see, oh, okay, well, this user actually is an owner of this control and should be performing it, but they also have access to either view the audit log or change the audit log. So they could go in and change it before they did something, change it after they did something, that you lose comfort there. And then if they are the reviewer and they can see what they're supposed to be reviewing and doing more or less a self-review, that kind of annuls the effectiveness of this feature. So just something to know when you're actually granting access to this. We can move on to the next slide, Garrett. Okay, so last concept I wanted to speak to after we've talked through how you identify those changes, what tools you have at your disposal, and how you monitor that ongoing, is the actual management of that going forward from a governance perspective, and just some of the key takeaways that may be slightly different in a SaaS environment versus traditional on-premise environments. So I'll speak to the verticals here, starting in the first lane, just speaking to production application security. So knowing back in the old world where a lot of that security, ongoing security governance and security provisioning was the responsibility of IT, now as customers use a combination of seated and custom roles and shift a lot of that ownership between business setup groups and IT setup groups, it's just a good best practice to make sure you constantly are evaluating your security and making sure that the appropriate folks aren't getting expansive access if they shouldn't have. And that's an easy bleed, and we just would like to call out the need to define a clear governance process around provisioning specifically. The second bullet there is speaking specifically to around who has access to change the production environment. So this is in addition to just who has access to what, making sure you know who has access to make those key configuration changes, given that can be very nuanced in the way the out-of-the-box role design works in cloud. And also just making sure, to the third bullet, making sure you understand who has access to push those changes between test and prod and making sure you understand if it's more of a break-fix scenario from a support perspective, who should be getting that access, how do I monitor it, and for how long, and how do I build a process around emergency provisioning to make sure that the appropriate folks don't retain expansive access going forward with something like the application implementation consultant role. Moving on to the second vertical, speaking more to true change management. So it's just the need is there to make sure you have a clear and robust process around change management, given this onus sits a lot with the business and IT support now than it used to with more of your back ops development function, given you're not touching the back end a lot in a SaaS environment. So just making sure you have a clear process around how that change is documented, what the business requirements are, if it's a routine change, and then putting that in front of a CAB or change approval board on a routine basis, and making sure you capture those key approvals from both the approval and the testing perspective is a key audit requirement in the SaaS world. The second bullet there plays a little bit into that as well, just making sure you have the clear roles defined for who should be testing what and making sure those testing results are clearly documented. That's normally an input into what you provide to the CAB for approval. So that's another key need in the SaaS world. And then the third bullet aligns somewhat with the third bullet and the first vertical there, just making sure that, outside of your true change approval board process that would capture your routine changes, if something is broken, just make sure you have an emergency access request process that clearly controls and provisions that effectively to get that fix implemented, but also make sure that nothing inappropriate happens. And then speaking to the third vertical briefly, just wanted to speak again to ongoing management of quarterly updates. Just make sure that from the high level perspective, you have the appropriate folks involved with what you're going to be implementing from the quarterly release from both the business and the IT perspective, and have them involved in testing as well. Whether that's just some of the functionality that's inherently going to get pushed down from Oracle, or if it's key options that you have to opt into, it's important to have alignment from both stakeholder parties on who should be testing what and how that's going to impact everyone involved. So just make sure that you consider that when you're going through what you're going to opt into and then testing appropriately. And then just remember that there's always that 2-week regression window after you implement that patch or that release. So being aware that you have that regression testing window to get in there and do that regression testing and perform that effectively within that time frame is always something important to consider. And then the third bullet aligns with what I spoke to on the prior slide. Just always consider that there are third-party tools that can help you report on key configuration changes and changes that will be pushed down from the patch. So you can use that as part of your testing process, as part of your review process, and part of your migration process, just to make sure that you're getting your tested and confirmed changes that are getting pushed down from the quarterly release successfully implemented into your production environment. So I think that covers this slide, Garrett. I'll move on. I think that's all we have from the content perspective, but we have a couple key takeaways. Again, just high level, I'll speak to each of these four. Garrett covers some of these and I cover the latter. Just make sure that you have the right stakeholders on the same page from both the original requirements gathering perspective on how your processes are going to work and what key changes are going to be in scope for your environment from an audit perspective, and then making sure you keep those same stakeholders involved throughout the process, from everything from testing, approval, et cetera, as that gets pushed to production. Make sure you use appropriate technology enablers as you need to. I know that's not always possible depending on what your headcount is and what your capabilities are, maturities are as an organization. But as you can, remember you have those tools at your disposal. Remember, security is always going to be a factor. So again, to what Garrett mentioned back in his portion of the slideshow there, always be aware of who has access to what and make sure that they have the appropriate access, and then also make sure that ongoing you have the appropriate processes in place to keep that access appropriate so that your control environment remains effective. And also during break fix scenarios and also during release management, the appropriate folks have the appropriate access to make sure you're successful in those efforts. And then the last one there, just as new technology is available, as processes evolve, and as the technology that is Oracle, SaaS, ERP, and HCM evolves, make sure that you're appropriately evolving with it to make sure that no unauthorized or often changes that you are unaware of get pushed down into your environment. And know that as you evolve, audit is also going to be evolving, both internal audit and external audit. So that's something that you're going to have to stay on top of regardless. With that said, Garrett, anything I missed before we open it up to Q&A?
No, Ryan. I think you hit the right spots. I think this is all too common of a situation. So again, I wouldn't want anyone to feel like they're doing something wrong. It's evolutionary. So Stephanie, I think we're time for some Q&A.
Great, thank you so much for your presentation. Again, if you have any questions, please add them now into the chat box. And let me just check. Okay, so our first question is, what are examples of a couple key or important settings most organizations elect to monitor?
Yep, I might take a pass at this, Ryan, and highlight ones that you really like. I find that a lot of my customers, they often say, "Can I monitor bank account numbers?" It's usually a target. There's almost a man in the middle type attempt to say, what if I could change a bank account? I could reroute dollars to a different end destination. So the fact that supplier bank accounts can have audit policies wrapped around them, that's nice. I also say anything that we're relying upon from a control perspective, if I could monitor that, I could then in theory minimize the annual burden to prove that they have not changed. So things like workflow, if we constantly look at and point to workflow as controls, if I have the ability to show, look, nothing's changed, it's the same settings, same participants, et cetera, it does accelerate and help the audit activity be a little bit lighter.
Perfect. Okay, our next question is, what are ways organizations can evidence changes if they don't have audit policies turned and they don't have a tool dedicated to monitoring them?
Ryan, you want to take a pass at that one?
Yeah, so I would say that unfortunately there's a little bit of a manual effort involved on that front when you do have that reality. I would say to start with, you still have OTBI at your disposal. So, building the correct reports that can get the correct populations of what you need to evidence would be the first and foremost activity I would go through. And then using that as kind of your starting point to identify, to the extent you can, the key configurations you've agreed upon, the transactions and the edge cases that you've agreed upon to show, what those values are, what they were, et cetera. Would be what I would start with. And then Garrett, correct me if you disagree, but also just making sure that if you're going through the correct change process, you're documenting that via screenshot or whatever the appropriate mechanism may be as part of your change approval board process to get that through into production. That should be your first preventative piece of that.
Yeah, okay. No, I agree. I think OTBI is often an avenue to back into. It's not perfect, but I think it's a good place to start.
Great. Well, that's all the questions we have for right now, but I do want to encourage anyone that if you do have any more questions, you can reach out to us at info@pathlock.com and we'll direct it to the appropriate person and make sure you get an answer. We have another session coming up today with SAP. This is titled Leveraging Generative Artificial Intelligence for Enhanced Identity and Application Access Risk Management in SAP Environments. I just put the link to that in the chat, and I also put a link to our full agenda. We have one more session, as I said, today, and then we have multiple sessions tomorrow if you would like to join any of those. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you, Garrett and Ryan, for your presentation, and thank everyone for attending, and we hope to see you at future sessions.